Hey everybody, I hope you're having a great day. I was a Jehovah's Witness for more than 2 decades, and when I finally woke up, I absolutely could not believe that I had been a victim of deception for so long, and yet it was 20 years after I got out before the indoctrination in my mind started to break down. As time went on, I realized that I was not the only one who felt this way. And what I'd like to do is take some time in this video to break down the tactics that were used to get us to this point of total indoctrination. For me, I was born into the religion, and my freedom came at a very high price. As a result of escaping, I lost the fellowship of my family and my friends. But for many, at one time they chose to become a part of this organization. So really, how is it that people get drawn into such a religion? Well, for many, the organization provided an illusion of comfort. Visitors coming to the Kingdom Hall were totally love-bombed, right? I did this, we all did this. We wanted people to think, to see that we were happy, to see that coming to the meetings was a good thing, was something that we all enjoyed. I did this, but deep down inside, I absolutely could not stand going to the meetings. They were so unbelievably boring, but we didn't want anybody to know this. We smiled at them, we made eye contact with them, complimenting and flattering them, and making them feel so special, like they were truly a part of a worldwide brotherhood of love. Before they knew it, they were a part of a new social group. We invited them to social gatherings, and many of them may not have had any type of social structure, and all of a sudden, here they are, a part of a big family. Not that I really ever experienced a lot of social gatherings. The congregation that I came from didn't have a lot of fellowships. I'll never forget one time I was invited to a Super Bowl party at a ministerial servant's house. There were a lot of married couples there, and it was just a lot of fun. We watched the game, we ate a lot of food. Nothing got out of hand. Everybody left after the game, and before we knew it, the elders had heard about it. And a few days later, the elders gathered around us and gave us a lecture on how having this Super Bowl party was inappropriate because football is considered idolatry. There never seemed to be any fun as a Jehovah's Witness, at least for me. And even though I was fully indoctrinated, I was pretty disgusted at this. And you know what? I don't really remember too many visitors coming to the Kingdom Hall. At least when I was in, it was always the same people at every single meeting. But what I learned is this love bombing tactic is very popular amongst high control groups, because what it does is it trains the brains of new recruits to associate the organization with love and acceptance. And for many, that's what they're looking for. Organizations like the Jehovah's Witnesses prey on people with low self-esteem, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all recruits have low self-esteem. Many are just lonely and looking for answers. Maybe they're just hurt or they've lost a loved one. But people with low esteem, you see, are great targets because they're easier for the cult to break down. Once they're broken down, it's easier to be built back up in an effort to teach them that the cult is the supportive environment that they're looking for. At this point, and while it may be obvious to people on the outside, it's not obvious to the new recruit, but they're actually thrilled to be a part of this new environment. They're making new friends, they're learning new things, they're being loved bombed, and they don't realize that the control is starting to build within them, and they're at the precipice of losing somewhat of their old identity, losing their individuality, and before they know it, they're eager and willing to join, and they don't realize the power that will soon be overtaking their brains to take over their lives. At this point, they're slowly starting to become isolated from their lives. The mentality of us versus them categorizes them as somewhat superior to people on the outside or worldly people. They start to realize that everybody on the outside is a part of Satan's organization, right? And that safety is only found within the organization. This was totally our lives. I believed this. I was afraid of everything on the outside of the organization, when in reality, that wasn't the case. I was so afraid to get out, even though I wanted to get out for so many years. It took me 10 years to get the courage to finally get out, when I had that cognizant thought that I no longer wanted to be a Jehovah's Witness. You see, this is what is called undue influence. It's any act of persuasion that overcomes the free will and judgment of another person. This is what happened to us. We were persuaded, manipulated, lied to such an extent that our free will and our judgment were totally compromised. The organization used manipulation and mind control tactics on us to such an extent that we became subservient to them. Isn't that right? Didn't we totally serve this organization? As I had mentioned earlier, I believed the organization and was totally indoctrinated into it even 20 years after I got out. I knew I didn't want to be a part of it, but that didn't mean I didn't believe it. I believed it. I just didn't feel like I could conform to it any longer. I felt like a total failure. I've put a link into the description box on a prior video that I had done, which goes into this much further. But about 20 years after I got out, maybe 15 years after I got out of the organization, I read a book that totally rocked my world. It was called 30 Years a Watchtower Slave, The Confessions of a Converted Jehovah's Witness. This was written by William J. Schnell in about 1956. And I'd like to read you a few excerpts from this book because this thing totally blew my mind. Now, a lot of people read Raymond Franz's book, Crisis of Conscience, which I did as well, but that was not the first book I read. This was the first book I read. Had I flipped them, this may not have had that much of an impact on me. I don't really know, but still to this day, this is such a great book. He wrote this book as a vow of gratitude to God for saving him from, in his words, what he calls a vicious network, the organization. He lays bare the inner workings of the organization as well. I'd like to read you something from the inner jacket of this book. He says, "It was in the year 1954 that William J. Schnell wrestled with God in prayer for an entire agony-filled night. As morning light broke, he arose with peace in his soul and a song in his heart. For the first time in 30 years, Schnell was a free man. For 3 decades, he had been enslaved in one of the most totalitarian systems of the 20th century. That morning, he stood up with the firm determination that with God's help, he would reveal to the world the inner workings of the Watchtower Society. The result is this entrancing book, 30 Years a Watchtower Slave, The Confessions of a Converted Jehovah's Witness." On page 43, he writes this: "The Watchtower Society was bent on eliminating the last vestige of individual thought and action within her ranks. and forthwith proceeded to the next step in the process. It timed this superbly. By 1927, they had put out millions of books. On page 44, he writes, "The mass of followers was sedulously," did I say that right? Sedulously trained to become entirely dependent for spiritual food upon the issuance of a bi-monthly issue of Watchtower, and to expect yearly some new organizational truth in a book, and some lesser truths in booklets, new enough each time to tickle the ears of the classes who itched for fabulous things." Do you remember going to the assemblies and a new book was announced? At each assembly, they sold thousands and thousands and thousands of copies, because what did the publisher do? They went out and they bought a copy. You would have thought that since we were peddling these books as salesmen, unpaid salesmen, they would have given them to us for free. Oh no, we had to buy our own books. Page 45, he says, "Members of these classes have believed every fable that the Watchtower Editorial Committee has invented and devised for their edification, even though this committee has time and again had to reverse itself. Some parables discussed in the columns of the Watchtower, usually interpreted to justify some organizational move, in this way have had to be reinterpreted some 3 or 4 times in the last 30 years. Keep in mind, this was written in the 50s. From all this, it is evident that these classes have blindly allowed to be raised over themselves this class of teachers, whose doctrines they follow solely because it tickles their ears." Isn't this true? We were so indoctrinated that we willingly did this. Let's see what Schnell has to say on page 65. "They believe that all the wicked shall be killed, and by the wicked they mean all who are not of God's organization, the Watchtower organization. They preach that all such who are of other organizations shall be destroyed, and the little children of such wicked will also be slain. In answering as to how to treat opposers to the truths promulgated by the Watchtower Society, if they were once members of the faith and have recanted, representatives of the society often say, it is impossible to kill them, as the laws of the land do not permit that. But were God's laws in effect, meaning we were as God's organization already, the New World Society, then they would be killed. The best thing to do under the circumstances is to treat them as if they were dead." I remember the publications telling us to do this. When I was a Jehovah's Witness, we were to treat disfellowshipped ones as if they were dead. Back then, there weren't many people who were disfellowshipped. Not very many in the congregation at all, but today is different. Let's move on to page 68 of Schnell's book. He says, "They began to use theocratic exactors and taskmasters to drive on the kingdom publishers, or better, kingdom slaves, to a better quota performance, to larger placements of books, or more regular attendance at the meetings. It seems that most of Jehovah's Witnesses, having sunk so low in individuality thinking, and having descended to the nadir, if I'm saying that word right, of a zombie-like existence, will put up with slavery if it is forced upon them top down, theocratically, by their own taskmasters. This slavery was by design. We're only doing what we were manipulated into doing, what we believed was serving God. We can't fault ourselves for falling victim to this. It was a very powerful delusion that came over us, and we fell for it. You see, having high intelligence is no protection from being victimized by a cult. They were masters. They were the taskmasters, and we were the slaves. Cult victims often spend years trying to overcome the emotional damage that was instilled as a part of the victimization. If you've heard of George Orwell in his book 1984, he writes this: "You will be hollow. We shall squeeze you empty, and then we shall fill you with ourselves." Isn't that what happened? We were hollow. We mindlessly attended the meetings and studied the books and underlined the answers and answered at the meetings in order to be in good standing and went out in field service. I had this recurring dream many, many years after I got out of the organization. Probably 20 years after I got out, I was still having this dream, and the dream was that it was approaching the end of the month and I didn't get my time in. And I looked at the calendar, and Saturday started a new month, and I had to work during the week, and I didn't know what I was going to do, and it was a nightmare. It turned into a panic. How many of you have felt that way, that the end of the month was coming and you didn't get your time in? How sad, how trivial, but we fell for it. But there's hope. When I picked up the Bible and read it independently of the books, I found the truth. I'd like to share a few scriptures with you. Let's take a look at Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. Jesus said, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." 1 Corinthians 14:33 says, "For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace." Turn to the Bible and the Bible alone for truth, as I did. I prayed, "God, I want untainted truth, no more lies. I don't want to have to get lost in Watchtower publications or anything like it that talks about a whole lot of fluff." On page 22, Schnell says in his book, he was in Germany, and he says, "I would spend all day Saturday traveling on the Ringbahn, a railroad which runs around the outer periphery of Berlin, witnessing loudly about millions now living shall never die, and selling the booklet for 25 pfennigs. I would dispose of 300 copies, getting about 75 Reichsmark contributions for the Watchtower, all of which I would turn over to their representative. They made many of us slaves." He goes on, "No one can read the history and literature of the Watchtower Society without thinking of Peter's words. Through covetousness shall they with feigned words make merchandise of you," in 2 Peter 2:3. They cited words of scripture, tore them out of their setting, and misapplied them to suit their own purpose. The eventual goal of selling books to obtain contributions of money to build up a worldwide Watchtower organization. Moving on, he says, and I totally agree with this, "These writings always contained a kernel of truth, particularly at the beginning as bait, but the whole was so weighted down and intertwined with organizational jargon as to set the befuddled reader's head in a whirl. Before the unwary victim realized it, he had surrendered all individualism, abandoned all personal thinking, and given up all private initiative. All this was designed to put the one who listened to these words into a position where he would read only the Society's books, booklets, and magazines. After he had acquired a taste for that kind of fare, the one so brainwashed was not only led into believing this Watchtower literature, but in his new position as Kingdom publisher, he was compelled to peddle this literature from door to door as the truth of the gospel." Schnell talks about attaining a book placement quota. He could be compelled against his wishes to go into certain territories. Can you think of a clearer example of men being made merchandise through the use of feigned words? Ephesians 3, verse 20 says, "Now unto him that is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us." I was just outside earlier taking a look at the water. Just outside of the dock, I saw these amazing jellyfish. They were just beautiful creatures with this transparent body, this organism that was propelling itself through the water. And I just thought of the amazing God who created us, the amazing God who loves us, the amazing God who died for us so that we could put our faith and trust in Him and be saved. There's no need for a watchtower organization. We don't have to trust the organization. Psalms 8 verses 3 and 4. When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man that thou visited him? You are loved, fellow ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, Jehovah's Witnesses, and anybody else who may be watching. Turn to Jesus. He loves you. He is the one who created you. Have a wonderful day.